programs where we've won at the top level, and have run programs as well where excuse me, where we haven't had a history of success or a culture of success. And the first thing we always do in those settings is we've got to make it fun. We've got to make it sure that people enjoy being in the setting. And as a coach, some of that is a little bit of silliness. When we get down to the shed, at 4:45 in the morning or whatever to start getting everything ready, it's being there at the door to greet them with a loud booming, morning.
Yo, what's up, everybody? Welcome to RowingCast. We got a new season, gearing up for our Head of the Charles vlog. And today we have Sam Dutney. Sam, I appreciate your time. Sam's over there in Australia. It's Sunday for him, and it's Saturday night for me. So, bear with us here. So, Sam, how are you doing today?
Yeah, really well, thanks, David. Thanks very much for having me on.
Of course. So, Sam, let us know what part of Australia are you from, and, what was life before you got into rowing?
So I grew up in Rockhampton, which is part of country Queensland, which is one of the northeastern state of Australia. So it's probably climate-wise, it's probably most similar to Florida for those in the US. So I grew up in a country town there, which is actually going to be the site of the rowing course for the 2032 Olympics, which is going to be for Brisbane, but the rowing will be up there. So I grew up in Rockhampton, and I got into rowing actually as a way of getting out of a school detention. So the day before I started my first day of high school, I don't know why, but I went on campus and to go to the uniform shop, and I was barefoot. And our school marshal, who was in charge of discipline and uniforms and all that sort of stuff, he was also the rowing master. And he stopped me right before the uniform shop, and he said, why haven't you got any shoes on? And I said, oh, sorry, sir, I just was ducking in to get something. I live next door. And he stopped and he said, what grade are you in, son? And I said, oh, I'm going into year 8, sir. And he said, put your arms out. And I put my arms out wide. And you probably can't tell here, but at 12 years old, I was 178 centimeters, so about 5'10", 5'11", and I had 185 centimeter arm span. So, about a 6'2" arm span. And at 12, and I think he took one look at me and went, all right, this guy's going to be my next project. And he said, all right, here's the deal. Tomorrow there's going to be a sign-up sheet here for rowing. You're going to put your name down, and in return, you're not going to get a detention for being barefoot on campus. So that was how I got into rowing. I think it was one of the great disappointments of his life that I never got any taller after that day. That's as tall as I was at 12, and it's as tall as I am today. But that was how I started in rowing, and then I spent before rowing. I, like a lot of people in Australia, I was really active in a lot of sports. I played soccer, I played tennis. I was a competitive swimmer. Being country town, and particularly back in the 90s, there was just a lot of, most of the things we did was outdoors. The other sport I was really big on before rowing was cricket, which is probably not that familiar to your audiences, but massive here in Australia, real cultural part of our society. And I was quite a handy cricketer through school as well. So that I'd played a variety of different sports, both bat and ball sports, but also endurance sports and swimming and cross country and things like that too. So that was my background before I really got into rowing. Although, as I say, I started rowing in year 8, my first year of high school, and ended up still here 23 years later.
That's pretty sweet. So what do you guys refer your coaches to as?
What do you mean by refer to our coaches as?
Yeah. So I heard you say rowing master or rowing.
Oh, right. I see. Yeah. So that was the title that was used at the school at the time. So we have generally speaking, they're going to be coaches, but whoever's in charge of the program, and this is the roles that I ended up taking on later in my career, was the terminology then used to be the rowing master, or the master in charge of rowing. And then, but over time, the titles generally changed to be either a head of rowing or a director of rowing. So most of my career, I started out coaching, and at that stage, I was just Coach Sam or Coach Dutney, and then later on, I became a head of rowing and then a director of rowing, which really just related to whether you reported to a director of sport or whether you reported directly to the principal.
Gotcha. That makes sense. And this leads on to my next question. What are the differences of Australian culture and rowing compared to, you know, American culture? Because even just that alone, I was like, oh, I didn't really look at it like that. But now that you've explained it, I mean, yeah, there's directors of rowing, and then there's head coaches, and there's, you know, and then there's assistant coaches. So I understand that like track record. But yeah, is there any like significant like differences between Australian rowing culture and American?
Probably from what I see is that we have a much more I would say a much more robust school rowing system here. So I feel like in the United States the college system is obviously massive across all sports, and rowing's no different. For us, the majority of people who row in Australia start rowing when they're in high school, and it's a lot rarer to have a pathway into I guess competitive rowing. And I don't mean competitive at an elite level, but just, you know, going to regular competitions and so forth by starting in university. It's just a lot harder to do. So most of the rowing in Australia is done through the high schools, and then people progress post high school into clubs, which are often associated with the universities. And that's where we have our, I guess, our national domestic competition. I think by nature of being such a large, you know, Australia geographically is pretty similar in size to the contiguous United States, but we have far more distance between our major population centres. But each of our major population centres has a relatively strong rowing culture and rowing history. So whether that's in Brisbane, in Queensland, or Sydney, New South Wales, Melbourne, Tasmania, here in Adelaide, which is where I live these days, or across in Perth, all the major population centres have quite strong rowing competitions, and often they'll have very strong school domestic competitions, which is typically called the Heads of the River, or the Head of the River in the various states for both the boys and the girls, and also then beyond school at a state championship level. And then that all kind of comes together at our national championships each year. So I know over in the US, you have the Scholastic Nationals, and you have the Youth Nationals, and you have the I've forgotten the name, but beginning with A, with the row fest in Ann Arbor. Ann Arbor. Thank you.
Yep.
And all the different head competitions. There's probably a lot more diversity in the United States around because of, I guess, the diversity across the country in terms of there's population everywhere. Here in Australia, we end up a little bit more siloed.
Got you.
And then we come together for the nationals. We have a few big head races, probably the biggest being the Head of the Yarra, which is at the end of November each year, which is an 8-kilometre eights race. And that's a massive sellout every year. It's a terrific event. And there's other head regattas we have across the country, but that's probably the one that gets the most people traveling from interstate, or I know some crews make the trip from New Zealand and so forth as well.
That's pretty sweet. So I kind of get it. I get that culture. So on the high school side, then it must be so much more competitive. I mean, in the States over here, I mean, we have our distinctions with Scholastic and like club teams, and, you know, there's a difference in speed there, but I'd imagine that no wonder we see so many great like products coming out of Australia in terms of like rowers, and why you guys are so competitive on that like national level is because you guys just have your own culture with it, but it's also way more competitive, and it's more like uniform, I guess, hearing it from you.
It's an interesting. So I've spent most of my career running school programs, but I've run masters programs. I've coached high performance programs, including international crews. I've coached all sorts of different people, but the majority of my time's been spent in the school system, and definitely the level of competition within it is, I think, is probably more comparable to the UK, who obviously have a phenomenal school system over there. I think sometimes it's easy to forget that the population of each individual state in Australia, of which we've only got 6, might, New South Wales and Victoria might be sort of 6 to 8 million total population, but of that, the actual rowing population might only be a few thousand people per year. So the pool isn't necessarily massive to draw from, but the level of competition is very high, and I think it's because of how seriously a lot of the schools take their rowing. So it's not unusual for someone who rows in a equivalent of a 3V in an Australian school system to still train 9-10 times a week, to still be surrounded at all times by the 1V athletes and and to receive coaching from them and so forth. So there's a lot of support. The other thing I think is as I understand is a little bit different, is there's probably a lot more small boat focus in Australia. less so than in, for instance, New Zealand, who I think takes it even that step further. Again, just a smaller population base.
Right.
But when I started, we were a 100% sculling program. So I learned to row in the single scull. We rowed singles, we singles, doubles, and quads. Most of the programs that I've run over the years has had a fairly large single sculling component. Even when we've been racing the eights at a national level and winning medals at the national stage and winning heads of the river and things like that, we still had sculling as a large component of the rowing, and both the skill development, but also things like selection. So culturally, there's probably also a lot less significance on the erg than there is in a lot of other places. And part of that, I think, is the weather, the fact that we can row 12 months of the year.
Yeah.
We don't get that kind of forced winter training block of, okay, you've got to stop and get inside on the ergs and spend a lot of time. So while they definitely play a pretty big role and they're involved in selection at all levels in Australia, I don't think that there is as much emphasis placed on them, certainly in preparation for them, as there are in other parts of the world. But I think that's, as I said, I think that's because of the weather.
Yeah, and I was just going to ask, and you answered my question already. I was like, so are you more like the traditional, I'd say like European route of like, starting into rowing, or, the track record into rowing, start with sculling? So yeah, in the States, it's iffy. Like some teams will start off, like middle school teams will be sculling based, but or they'll just throw them in eights. So yeah, you've answered that question for me. So that makes more sense. And in all honesty, if you learn how to scull first, right? I started out in the 8, right? And I didn't get into like sculling until I was in college. So that was when I really got to understand like boat feel and how you can like really manipulate and like make the boat work for you in more ways. So I think it always starts off like in that small boat. So let's go back to you like in grade 8. Like what was that like getting started into rowing?
So I mean, I loved it really early on. I mean, it was being out on the water. I think I remember the first moment that I was like, wow, this is for me, was I was rowing and was just the feeling of in a single scull. I'd been, I'd fallen in a couple of times and wasn't sure if it was something I was going to, continue with. And I had a particular session where I just got that feeling of actually having the blades in the water and feeling the boat move past the oar, and just went, wow, that felt amazing. I think in some ways rowing is probably most similar to golf and surfing in that you can have an absolutely horrendous session and then a couple of good strokes will just bring you back again the next time. And same in golf, you can have an absolute stinker and play a couple of good strokes and go, wow, actually that was a great day out. And surfing, you can be out there I was a surfer and a golfer, so this is why I recognize it. But you can be out in the waves for an hour and get nothing, and then get one good wave and be like, oh, can't wait to do that again. I think rowing's very similar. But that was kind of the first moment that I really got it. But I wasn't, despite being fairly tall for my age, I didn't kind of take to rowing really quickly in terms of doing well. We had a phenomenal program up in Rockhampton with a couple of amazing guys in my age bracket who, you don't appreciate at the time, but one went on to win a silver medal at the Olympics, and another one won a gold medal at senior A level at the World Championships. So I shouldn't have felt bad that I was consistently being beaten by them, but I wasn't immediately in the top boat or anything like that. And for a decent chunk of my first season, I just spent basically rowing the single largely on my own. Without a lot of coaching, just the nature of our program. We had one coach and he was brilliant, a really hugely successful and amazing coach, but he was difficult to manage everyone at once. And he, so, those early days, I was maybe lucky to get 5 minutes of coaching per session. And I just went out and rowed and I loved it. And I remember I joined the squad, the guys who were going a bit better and were in the top boat at the time, for a time trial one day. And I think I came 4th. And the coach realized I was rowing in a tub scull and everyone else was in a racer. And he went, oh, that was actually really good, Sam. Next time, do you want to come out in a racing single? And which I did. And then I went faster and faster and ended up in the crew. But it was it was a great experience. And I rowed with some really terrific guys who I still keep in touch with. And we actually, that coach, he passed away this week, actually, from cancer. And about at the end of June, after it was found out he was terminal, we had a living wake for him. So people because he'd been coaching for 60 years, and people from all different decades came and celebrated his life. And it was great to see all of these people who I'd rowed with, years and years ago. I think it's something about the relationships you build with the people that you row with, that it had been years since we'd seen each other, but it was like no time had passed at all, and we just got on immediately. So I think you build these really, really special relationships with the people that you row with, and that was a big part of what I loved about it at school. And one of the things I always tried to get across to the people that I coached, particularly in school settings, was that these days are some of the best of your life, and the people that you're with are going to be part of your life for a long time, and always have those friendships and those relationships, which is something, having played a lot of different sports, is not always the same. It's not always the same in all sports, and rowing, I think, is quite special in that regard.
Yeah, I understand that. And Sam, so sorry for your loss, man. I understand how that feels, man. I understand how that feels. I was gonna say, I think that's one of the main things that I noticed just in crew in general when it comes to like development with athletes and whatnot is a lot of kids start in the sport because their friends are in it, or they make friends in the sport. And that kind of is the glue that keeps them into it. And then, there's usually something that clicks where like, oh, well, like going fast is fun, you know what I'm saying? And doing it. And then you can have fun with your friends while you're doing it and stuff like that. So I love seeing that like happen, in real life. So, and as a coach, you get to see it year round. Like you get to see like new stories, like, basically come together year round. So I love that. Anything that comes to mind that was like, yo, I really like enjoy being around this group of like guys and stuff like that, or anything that comes to mind?
Yeah, there was a crew I coached I've had lots of great crews that have done really well, and great relationships with the people who rode in them, and still occasionally see them years on, and they'll buy me a beer or whatever and run into each other. But there was one particular crew back in 2013. It was at Brisbane Boys College when I was coaching the coaching there, and I coached the year 11 first eight that year. So here in Queensland, they do quads in year 8, 9, and 10, and then they do a year 11 eights competition and a senior eights competition. And it was just the most fun. It was such a great group of guys who really enjoyed each other's company, and just kept going from strength to strength as the season went on. And very fast crew. They won the head of the river, and they were just very, very competitive with each other in a really positive way that pushed each other along. And they were just fun. It was just a fun season that we had fun on the water. We had fun going fast. They got to do some really cool trips away interstate, going and racing in different parts of the country, against winning some medals down in Sydney. And in Grafton, there was a Christmas regatta that they went to that they won the under 17 8 in, and they just had a great season. But a lot of those people I've kept in touch with over the years since. And what was special was also seeing a lot of those guys go on to continue rowing, not just the following year, but beyond school as well. One of them rowed for Australia, but numerous of them went on to row club and at university beyond school as well. So they just loved it, and it was probably one of the most fun seasons that I remember as a coach. And that's not to take away from any of the others. And there's been crews that had, I would say, better transformations and better results, but they were just a really great group of people to be around.
Yeah, I understand that. I get that. Anything that comes to mind from your adolescence, so from when you started rowing?
I mean, my year 12, my last season of high school was just fantastic. From racing at the nationals, just being with these guys who I'd rowed with for 5 years, and kind of reaching that end of the journey together was just special. I think when you've been in those environments with people for a long time, where you've been working hard and you've been training and you've been through a lot together, I think there's something deeply deeply satisfying about coming to the end of that journey together and still all being there. And as I said, they end up being those relationships that you keep for a long time in your life. But that year had a couple of great great days or just individual days that I loved. I still really remember, even though it was a little bit, cheesy, I suppose, but we had a regatta that landed on Father's Day, and I was racing the double that day with the number one rower in our squad, who went on to win a silver medal in Rio. And he said, all right, Dutes, what do we got to do to get over the line, to get us over the line today? And I said, it's Father's Day. I want to win a gold medal for Dad. And I just remember, there wasn't anything wrong. I think when we got 500 meters out, and he said, "Come on, Dutes, let's do it for your dad." I think everyone thought he had cancer or something like that, and but it wasn't. It was just thought I just had this vision of how cool it would be to win it, get the medal, row into the dock where I knew you'd meet him, and just be able to hand it over and say Happy Father's Day. And we were able to do that, and that was a really cool little moment. But honestly, all the different competitive experiences, I say often that all your wins feel the same. And I remember the very first regatta I ever did. At that stage, I wasn't in the top crew, so I just raced the single at that regatta. It was a 500-meter regatta at a little country town, and I think I rode the Division 4 single, and there was one other person in the race. He was a year younger than me, and I crushed him, and it was such a great feeling. not from the competition, but just the feeling like I'd been working hard, I wanted to do well, and I had a really good race, and I got that win. And I would go on in the future to win national championships and things like that, but I wouldn't say that any of them felt any different. It almost doesn't matter. I think when wins all feel the same, and wins also don't have to be coming first either. I would say that winning is the you get to define your own frame of reference for what winning is, and winning can be coming first, or it can be a personal best. It can be making an A final. There was a crew that I coached one year, a schoolgirl crew, who prior to that season I coached them, they had never not finished last in a race. Had never finished better than last place, and we ended up coming third at the head of the river, and that was unbelievable. I remember the day we qualified for the A final, they were in tears. The parents were in tears. They just couldn't believe that this group of girls who'd just never done anything, and we didn't win, we didn't come first, but that it was absolutely a win to make the A final and then to finish third was just really special.
That's pretty sweet. That's really great to hear. Question, like, how do you work with a crew like that then? And we'll come back to your story in a minute, but how do you work with a crew or a team that's had just not the best performances, and at least change that? How do you change that?
Well, the first thing we did with them, and they've done in lots of other programs, I've run some really successful programs where we've won at the top level, and I've run programs as well where where we haven't had a history of success or a culture of success. And the first thing we always do in those settings is we've got to make it fun. We've got to make it sure that people enjoy being at the stage. And as a coach, some of that is a little bit of silliness. When we get down to the shed, at 4:45 in the morning or whatever to start getting everything ready, it's being there at the door to greet them with a loud booming, morning, just add that little bit of that flair and silliness. And I used to say things to them like, what day is it today? And then I'd just say, Tuesday. I said, no, it's the best day of your life. And just really push those kind of things. Why is it the best day of your life? Because that's just a very good way to live your life. And if every day is the best day of your life, then one day you're actually going to make that happen. You're going to make it true. And we, and I'd ask them all the time, what day is the day? Oh, best day of my life. And, you get a bit of an eye roll. But over time, I can remember being at the end of a camp, like a training camp with that group. And when they did the photo and, people say cheese or whatever, and they said, what are we going to say? And they just all as one unprompted yelled, best day of our lives. So, creating those kind of environments that people want to be there, they want to come to training, it makes it a lot easier to work hard. I always say a happy crew is a fast crew. So that would always be the first thing. And then the second way was, I talked before about defining your own terms for winning, and making it based around your own frame. So we would focus on that winning for us, from early in the season was about, they'd never beaten the crew. We said, all right, the goal is to make the A final. And that was a bit of like, oh my goodness, how are we going to do that? But we started by, we wanted to look, think, and feel like an A final crew. And that if we could look, think, and feel like an A final crew, then we would give ourselves the best chance. So it started with even simple things like, when you turn up to training, you all wear the uniform properly. we're not a bunch of, we're not a rabble. We take ourselves seriously. What do we think about when we make decisions? The classic, what would Jesus do? But what would an A final crew do? Would an A final crew do the extra session? Would an A final crew, be 5 minutes late so that we could actually finish the workload? All those kind of things, and so that they then actually felt like, hey, we are a crew that that does it. We made that the goal because I knew if they could achieve that goal, they would act like an A final crew. And if they could act like an A final crew, they would do the things that an A final crew does and give themselves a chance of doing it. So that was for that particular group, that was the focus, was first make it fun, but then that second was to look, think, and feel like an A final crew. And they just kept improving because they did the things that would help them improve. Because I think fundamentally, until you get to the really pointy end of rowing, you can always get faster. There are people I've coached, in the last 12 months, for instance, who've gone from, on the female side, who've gone from the 750s into the 710s, and not overnight, but it's just a continual process of, we don't accept that we can't improve. And then I think everyone can still seek improvement. And when you've got a crew at that level, they obviously definitely can continue to improve. And so we just that became part of the motivation as well, as they saw that the work they were doing was improving and they were motivated to keep doing it.
So that's great to hear. Yeah. So I've always worked with crews, and even starting out my career, I was part of the first group of male rowers in our school. So they'd always had a women's team. They never had a boys team. So I was part of the first cycle of that. So we had to try to figure out, we had to kind of be groundbreaking and figure out what works for us and what was going to work. And we would always put up the mindset is whatever we're doing right now, is that helping the boat go faster? And then I move on to college, and that was actually when my college coach would always, ask us, in every decision that you're doing, is this going to help the boat go faster? Is this going to help you be where you want to be? Is this going to help you get to your goals? So I remember being a B-level crew and being, in the B final, and then moving up to the A final, and I understood, the preparation that it took with that. So yeah, it's great to try to instill that. And it's great to hear that you made it fun first, and then now you made achievable, achievable reference points to get to the goal. So that's really great to hear. For you, Sam, what did life look like after senior year? And how did you get into coaching?
After I finished high school, I originally studied law, and I started rowing at. So I had a little bit of time off from rowing. And then when a few months after the end of school, and then when I came back to rowing, I started rowing again with Toowong Rowing Club, which was my local community club in Brisbane, where I'd moved for university. So I didn't know that rowing was something that lots of people knew about, and I was working as a waiter at a restaurant, and I heard these people talking about sculling, and I just went on and said, "Oh, you guys rowers." And it turned out they were the Australian under-23 lightweight men's crew, and with the coach. And I was just chatting I rowed at school. I won a medal at the nationals, and they were all like, "Wait, what?" And I was like, "Yeah, because I just thought it was this totally niche thing." And then they invited me to come down for a row, and it was quite funny. I remember we'd always used to row at about 6 a.m. when I was at school, and as I said, we were an all sculling program, and I got this phone call from I'd given the coach my number, and he gave me a call and said, "Yeah, if you'd like to come down tomorrow morning, we're going to be on the water at 4:45, and we're going out in the 4." And I said, 4:45, in the morning, and a 4? And he said, "Yeah, is that a problem?" I said, "Oh, no, that'll be fine. Just so you know, I've never rowed sweep before." Anyway, so I went out for this row with these guys who were under 23 national team rowers and stuff, and we rowed about 9K, and we stopped to turn around, and he came up and he was giving everyone some feedback, and he got to me and he went, "Sam, you haven't rowed sweep before," which is just a very kind way of saying what are you doing? But that was how I got back into it, and I really enjoyed it. And it was a little bit of a similar experience to when I'd first started at school, because these guys were national team rowers. I was straight out of school. I wasn't at that level. And initially, I'd occasionally go out for a row in a 4 or whatever. and fill in a little bit. But mostly I just got back into it, and I'd go out in a single and I'd row 20K up and back just casually. I remember I used to strap my wristwatch to the foot plate, and I'd just start the timer and see how quickly could I get to the 10K mark, and then I'd turn around and see how quickly could I get back. And each week I just tried to, it wasn't necessarily like a time trial or anything, but I just sort of set myself to go, I'm not going to stop. I'm just going to row up, turn around, come straight back. How quickly can I do it? Can I do it faster next week? Can I do it or the next day and the next week? And then after a few, probably 6 weeks or so of that, the coach went, Sam, you're out here every day. I keep seeing you up at the Indooroopilly Bridge. You must be doing 20K a session. I was like, yeah, no, that sounds about right. And he said, well, do you want to come out for a row with the elite squad? I was like, yeah, okay. And that was how I basically got invited into that group. And I rode a couple of seasons there with them. Some great guys who were going to win world championships, things like that. So it's just surrounded by some really terrific guys. But it was around that time that I got into coaching. And again, a very inauspicious start. My housemate, who'd been my coxswain at school, he was coaching at a local high school. Just year 9 crew or something, might even been a year 8 crew, I can't remember, division 4 or something. And he mentioned that they were short on coaches, and so I said, oh, I'll come down and help. And so I'd started coaching while I was rowing in the elite squad, and then it was towards the end of been rowing a couple of seasons, and I'd been coaching the whole way through at a fairly modest level. And I went, I probably actually enjoy coaching more than I am competing. And that was when I made the transition into, I stopped rowing myself. And initially I actually coached the youth elite squad at the club, while also coaching schools. And it was from there that I went from, we won national championships, had guys get selected in representative teams, and then started getting some results at school level as well. And that kind of confirmed my decision to go into the coaching side. And within sort of 2 years of that, I was coaching a school first 8, so 1V, and then I think it was 2 years after that I got my first director of rowing job, which was at a school that was a big school in Melbourne, and that was kind of the real launch for my serious coaching career of being in leadership roles and running programs and everything that kind of came from there.
So, off of your experience of coaching, what are some characteristics and what are some qualities that you think individuals might learn from the sport?
I think as individuals, there's so much about rowing that like I said, people say rowing builds character. I don't think it does. I think it reveals character. I think it puts you in situations to show you what was always there. I don't actually think you build something through it. And that's why some people don't thrive in rowing. We all know people who started and then couldn't handle, didn't enjoy it. It's completely fine. Not everything's for everyone. The world would be a very boring place if everyone was exactly the same. But I think it reveals character, and I think it really develops. It reveals qualities like time. Obviously, things like time management, the ability to work with others who you may not be friends with, but you have to be able to respect and work cooperatively, which I think are massively important life skills. I think that's almost one of the most important things that you do learn through rowing is you have to be able to have a mutual respect with people who you maybe on a personal level you don't like or you don't agree with. I think it's probably something the whole world could use a little bit more of now, would be some mutual respect. But I think that's one of the great qualities. I think obviously, as I said, things like time management, the ability to set and achieve goals, the ability to break things into actionable tasks. I think these are great and very important skills for rowing. One of my favorite things that I like to tell people in terms of that actionable steps is, apart from the look, think, and act, look, think, and feel, is the idea that if you want to, let's say that you're racing in a crew and you're 6 seconds behind the leading boat, your goal shouldn't be to go 6 seconds faster. Your goal should be to go 1 second faster 6 times, because not only is that a far more achievable target each step of the way, and if you achieve each step of the way, even if you don't get there by the end of the season, you're still going to be a lot closer than if you tried to make the big jump in one go. But you also get to win 6 times. We talked about framing winning as being able to define your own terms. If your winning terms are to be 1 second faster each time, and you do it 6 times or 10 times, or for some people on the erg, it might be 20 or 30 times over the course of a season. You get to win 20 or 30 times. You get to define yourself as someone who sets and achieves goals, who accomplishes what they set out to do. That is an important skill in life, because if you can do that, then you can do almost anything in any field. If you can break it down into the small, actionable steps that give you the win, and you do it enough times, then you're going to give yourself the chance to be successful. And I saw that in rowing, in coaching. I saw that at university. I've seen that in in the different leadership roles I've had over the years, and I've seen it in business as well.
Yeah, I think that's perfect. I always look at it like that, just how I wanted to always improve, maybe on the erg. Maybe for me, a lot of it in college was technique, because I was always erg dominant, and I live in the Midwest in the States, so it was really cold. That's all we would do is erg. So I was always great on the erg, but when I was on the water, I mean, I could barely backsplash. I've had clinics learning how to, just enter the blade the right way. So totally understand that. And then putting it into a work setting, yeah, I'm gonna isolate the things that I need to work on, and I'm gonna hammer at it. And yeah, it's not gonna come overnight, but you can definitely, it can definitely be achievable. So that's great. That's great. And I was going to ask you, what do you think are some misconceptions that you may have had about coaching before you got into coaching?
Probably the biggest one was that everyone was like me. I remember that when I first started coaching, there'd be, you'd expect things from people and it wouldn't happen. And I'd be like, well, why aren't they doing it? And eventually I realized, one of the rules I set for myself was, if people don't do things the way you want them to, you should always assume that it's your fault. You've not communicated clearly, or if they're not doing it because they're not motivated, you've not created an environment where they are motivated to do it. So that was a lesson from that. But definitely when I started, I assumed that everyone was basically the same and had basically the same motivations and wants and willingness to do things, and that's not true. Everyone's different, and learning that. So I think learning that you actually had to try different approaches with different people, and that goes people who are in a team as well. Some people need an arm around the shoulder, some people need a kick up the bum, some people need inspiration, some people need targets set for them, some people need encouragement. Yeah, everyone needs something different. And I think that was one of the first misconceptions, was that you could have a one size fits all approach, and you just can't. I think probably one of the other things I have come around to over the years was the only way you could get faster was to do more. That was, having come out of the experiences I'd had when I was younger, and I saw myself, get invited to Elite Squad by virtue of being out there rowing 20K 6 days a week. People going, wow, he's actually doing a lot of volume. You do want to come in and join with us. But what I found when I actually started coaching was that, again, everyone being different, everyone needs a different thing as well in terms of the training stimulus. And that's where part of my background. I started out studying law. I ended up going back and studying exercise and sports science, and working as an exercise physiologist and strength and conditioning coach, and learning about all of these other elements of the physically putting together successful crews and rowers. And that was one of those misconceptions, was realizing that sometimes volume wasn't the only answer. Less was rarely the answer, but more didn't necessarily mean better. And also that, on the same thread, is that just like everyone needs different motivation, everyone needs different things in their training. Some people are aerobic, some people are anaerobic, some people are, are hard gainers. They struggle to put on weight and to build strength. Some people are naturally inclined that way. Everyone's different. And where possible, I found that we got the best results by being flexible with individuals, even in a crew setting where, the water is the water. You can't change what people are doing. And if you're in an 8, everyone's doing the same thing. But what you do off the water can actually vary from one person to the next. There's no such thing as a one size fits all. And that's something in the research that I've read, as well as my own anecdotal experiences. I know there was a great study that was put out that was later redacted because of some issues around the ownership of the information, but that was done about the Kiwi pair after the Rio Olympics. It showed that Eric Murray and Hamish Bond were actually trained differently off the water to one another, even though they rode the pair together. And that even at the highest level, there's still that individualization. But I think probably one of the misconceptions that I had early was that was maybe something that happened at that level and not something that needed to happen at a lower level. We were forced into making some adjustments that in one of the school programs that I ran, because there's a regional program and we had people who in some cases traveled an hour to get to training. And some people traveled 10 minutes. So not everyone could do the same thing. So we actually had to modify what we did off the water so that that everyone could get the kind of the best results for them. And it was really successful. We ended up having our best ever season once we started doing that. And that was something I carried into all the future programs that I ran and all the coaching that I've done since.
All right. The next question I have for you, Sam, is really based off of this. How do you teach athletes, and this is the best way that I could describe it, and maybe you might have a better term of describing it, but athletic intelligence. So like having the understanding of like how to redline or how to justify where they are, energy wise. Like I'm not expecting every kid to wear a whoop that's going to tell you right your stress levels and everything like that. But like how do you teach that to someone who may not even have any like athletic, experience before they get into the sport?
So I think, again, it's about dealing with individuals. So some people are going to come into it and they've been high level, in athletics or in soccer or football. That they've got some of those skills already. And certainly running school programs, we would see that there were people who were who had come from high level athletic backgrounds already, and they, some of those things you pointed out, they kind of not innately, they'd already learned. I think they are learned skills. I don't think they are innate. I think some of the things that I've seen has been, you want to create environments where people, not regularly, but not never either, that people are given the opportunity to fail and fail in a constructive way, where there's the proper reflection, there's an understanding of, okay, well, why did we fail? What can we learn from that? To give you a personal anecdote, I mentioned that I was in a sculling program. I'd never done an ergo when I left school, not once. And so the first ergo that I did was in that club environment, and I'd never been on I hadn't even done a training session on an ergo before. My first one was a 2K, and I had no idea how to pace it. I knew how I raced the single, which was to try and get in front and stay there. Our old racing strategy had been, at school had been to rate in the quad, had been to rate 40 until you had a boat length lead and then rate 36. That is not the approach I would suggest to anyone for the 2K ergo, but it's all that I knew. And so I think I was a lightweight. I think my first 500 meters was about a 126, which, for those of you who are playing along at home would know that 126 would get you, a lightweight world record. You may be surprised to learn I do not hold the lightweight world record on the ergo. I think I ended up limping home to about a 7:12 or something. I can't even remember. It wasn't great. And just seeing how badly paced it was not because I didn't know how to push myself, but I didn't know how to actually properly pace myself. So that was a fail. That was a fail, but I learned from it. And it only took me a couple of weeks later, so it wasn't that I was much fitter. I think I did like a 6:36 or something like that. So it was just from the learning. So I think learning to fail in different environments, finding where those limits are, and then but not doing it all the time. Because if you try and push people to those very limits over and over again, they just start to shy away from it. They just can't put themselves there. The brain won't let them, because it's pretty good at protecting us. So you've got to have, the right moments to do it. I think, another big part of it is that toughness, particularly for people at a relatively novice level, toughness comes from fitness. If you get fitter, it's easier to be tough. So that can just happen over time. And I know lots of people who didn't seem that. I remember having a conversation once with a coach who was working for me, who said that, the crew's just not that tough. And I said, that's ridiculous. Just keep building up the fitness and see what happens. And unsurprisingly, 3 months later, everyone remarked how gritty and how tough that crew was. And I was like, they just run fit at the start of the season. That's all. They're fit now. So, I mean, obviously at an elite level, you could like a Finn Hamill in the Diamond Skull at Henley, and he's clearly a mentality monster. I think something like that is difficult to replicate in all of us. But he also, I'm certain, he wasn't born that way. He would have been he's product of his environment, know his dad was a rower, and he's competitive and surrounded by people in that sort of setting, and he's learnt to push himself, and he's had to do that as well. You know, I don't want to suggest that he has no agency in it by any stretch of the imagination, but he has developed those skills, and we can all develop our skills to be more, you know, mentally tough, to be able to put ourselves closer to the red line. Different people, like anything, you know, there's going to be a level of inherent skill in that direction, but I think we can all learn to do it better, and we do it, you know, tactical failing, by just building up our fitness, and I think also building up more sense of body awareness. I'm a really big one from a coaching perspective, of teaching people to understand what muscles are being turned on and turned off, so that they can actually utilize what they've got to the best of their ability. And I find that can be really helpful, because often in hard moments in rowing, whether it's racing or on the ergo, if you can put the focus onto using your muscles and making the movements correctly, you can hold speed even when, you know, the energy is not quite there. You know, you can make a boat stay at speed through technique to a large extent. You know, late in the race or through the middle, you can keep the boat speed up there through the quality of the movement, not just by being you know, physically there. So I think that actually helps, and that can sometimes look like athletic intelligence and can look like toughness and so forth, but actually it's just the ability to use what you've got more intelligently, so that in those hard moments, instead of just thinking about I have to try more, this is how I'm going to keep the speed up. I think that's something people often neglect.
Yeah, I definitely think about that as well, because I really think about, like, in college, in the middle thousand of like a 2K race, just isolating my focus on legs, or, you know, just, I mean, you could pick whatever aspect of it, but I isolated my legs and just making sure that drive was like right on par with everyone else. And that would get me through it mentally as well. So now I'm like, okay, now I'm going to last 500, or I'm going to last 250. All right, now let's rip it. So I love that aspect, and I love athletes figuring that whole aspect out as well. So yeah, I totally agree with you on the right, like a stage failure, right? Like not always like setting a kid up for failure and being like, oh look, well, you know, one day you'll figure it out. It's like, nah, like yeah, I enjoy that. So thank you for that. I really appreciate it. So let me know what it is like to be a rowing director. What comes with what are the duties that comes with that, and what do coaches not understand about like rowing directors' duties and whatnot?
I think everyone understands that, you know, you're dealing with parents, and particularly in the Australian context where most of the rowing is done through the private schools, you're dealing with parents who are spending a lot of money, whether it's just at the school in general and have an overall expectation of, I guess, the product that they're getting, or where they're paying additional levies for rowing, which could be $3,000, $4,000, $5,000 a season. There is there's pretty high expectations. I think everyone kind of knows that. I've been threatened with being sued twice in those roles. Once was for a student. We were sued for unsuccessfully. For criminal negligence in allowing her son to become morbidly obese because we didn't force him to row. That's sort of an example of some of the weird thinking you sometimes get. There was another person who threatened, but I didn't end up going through with, said their daughter was selected in the third eight, and their goal was to be in the first eight. And it was, well, now she's not going to get a college scholarship, and she's not going to be able to become a doctor. And the threats were to sue for future loss of earnings. Sometimes you get some really, I would say, far out there parents who the expectations just don't fit reality. And I've been told, you know, that, you know, you're the worst person in the world. So there's actually a fairly big emotional load that you carry, because, and you have to respect it in those roles, that when you're dealing with, you know, whether they're adults or whether they're kids, that these are people, in a lot of cases, they've invested a lot of themselves into the result they're hoping to get. And, you know, particularly around things like selection, when they don't get selected, you have to have a good process to manage that. And sometimes I think, because you have to be fair on them. You have to be also fair in how that information is given and the support that you provide to them afterwards, because emotionally that there's so much in them. And that, someone doesn't get picked in a crew and you get told, well, you're the worst person in the world for not picking them. But you've got to appreciate the emotional investment and time investment and potentially financial that they've made into that, and have a respect for it. So one of the things a lot of the coaches that I've had under me maybe haven't understood is why I've always been a massive advocate for an objective selection policy. So where we record things, it is done. The programs I've run, I've never allowed coaches discretion, which often, coaches want to be able to pick their crews. They want the people they want to work with. And the thing is, we have to be able to evidence the decisions that we've made. And it's not to protect ourselves, which I think sometimes they think it is. It's because we have to be fair to the people who don't get that. They have to be able to understand why they haven't made it. And as a coach, to say to someone, oh, look, I just haven't seen enough from you to be able to, okay, well, what's the feedback you've given them? How have you told them along the way? We're not seeing enough from you. Well, you need to do more of this. Okay, I told you last week I needed to see more of this. I haven't seen it yet. Because they might think they are doing it. Like, if you don't create objective, so when people don't have objective measures and they rely on subjective, the level of additional feedback and input that needs to go onto it to actually be fair to the athletes often just doesn't happen. And so that's why, to help the coaches, I've always used an objective selection. The other thing is, I think coaches might often think that you judge your success as a director of rowing on the number of first places or the kind of the high performance end. My personal metric for how successful I had been in my role as a director of rowing on any given season was that people didn't even know you were there. When you were doing things right and everything just ran smoothly and people just didn't really have any complaints, that was a sign you did your job well, because it meant that the unglamorous stuff, like making sure all the equipment worked, if people were always having to fix shoes and fix issues with the boats, you're not doing your job as a director of rowing. And I know you might have a boatman who you're managing to physically do the job, but you've got to make sure it happens. So it's about managing people. I always loved it. It was never didn't enjoy doing it. And the reason I moved away from it was only because I had my own kids, and I went, they were born in the middle of rowing season, and I went 47 days. So they were in the NICU. We had a really traumatic pregnancy. They were born preemie. We have twins. And they were in the NICU for weeks, and I went 47 days without seeing them awake in the middle of rowing season, because I was out of the house before they were awake, and that was after they came home. And I just went, I can't keep doing that to my family, and that's why I made my own transition out of the director of rowing roles into what I'm doing now. But I never didn't enjoy it. It was always phenomenal. You got to work with so many great people. You got to really feel you had an impact on a lot of people as well. Is brilliant. But those things, you have to manage the emotional side of it for the athletes to make sure that they're fair, because they actually, what might not seem important to you as a coach, you might think, oh, it's only the year 10 third quad, who cares? Well, to the person in it, they really do care, and it's really important to them. So you have to be fair on them, and you have to give them the support to understand why they haven't succeeded, and also to give them a fair chance to succeed. And then the other side of it is that real success in that role is that no one knows that you're doing anything at all. Not in the sense of, like, obviously, where are they? And everything's wrong, but the sense that everything just runs smoothly, and they go, oh, I don't even know what Sam does. So, well, he's making sure everything's running smoothly. That's what he's doing.
That's sweet. That's sweet. So I was going to ask you, so tell me a little bit about Top Crew Academy. So, and what was your transition out of it? I mean, it makes sense. Like, I think that's a pretty big component for a lot of rowing coaches and rowing directors and stuff like that, is, right, you want to see your family, and this sport is a year-round sport. And I could imagine, even with the weather being so nice, that over there, year-round, you're always going to be busy in that term. So, yeah, tell me about that transition.
So the initial transition, I went, because I was already working in schools at that time, I actually transitioned into being a director of sport, thinking that if I didn't have to be at all of the training sessions and so forth, that might solve the issue. But ultimately it didn't. So I started Top Crew Academy about 18 months ago. And initially it was helping out some people who, I'd coached their elder siblings or whatever through, when they were at school, and now they were coming in, they wanted to make their school's top boats, or they wanted to get recruited for colleges. So initially I started out working with high school athletes, with I guess additional training, so programming and coaching and technical feedback, and because of my experience in my education, sports science, I could also provide help around things like nutrition, and just because of the strength and conditioning background, I could provide help in those areas as well. So initially, that's how I started, was working with them, and then as I started to do some more of my own rowing again, and realizing that there was just no support for masters, and that most clubs, the limited resources, volunteers, a lot of the resources are being directed towards, the youth programs or the high performance pathways and that type of thing. That there was just a lot of people out there who were, rowing all the time and working really hard and just didn't have support, didn't have information. Information was always geared for younger athletes or for for elite performers, not for people in their 40s or their 50s or their 60s who row 5 or 6 times a week still, but don't recover like someone in their 20s, can't train in that same way. So that was sort of a little bit of a transition. Now I still work with a lot of high schoolers, but was working a lot more with masters and helping them to develop, building personalized programs that take into account their individual physiology, their goals, and also their schedule, because that's one of the big areas that a lot of they might have weird, quote unquote weird schedules compared to a standard program that might have, Monday, Wednesday, Friday, Saturday rows, a nice simple flow. It's not always the way for masters rowers, and that's been great. I had about 10 athletes who were at the Australian Masters Rowing Championships earlier this year, and collectively they won 23 gold medals, and would have, if we were a club, we actually would have topped the medal tally at the Masters Nationals, which was pretty cool. And since I've helped some people to, over at Banyola's at the moment for the World Championships, we've had 5 or 6 gold medals over there for people I'm working with, and somebody won the single at Henley Masters. And so there's been great to help people have a lot of success, but also being great to help some people who are more of what I would term the recreational or competitive recreational level. They don't have any big goals, but they just want to get faster. They want to know they're doing the right thing. And that's been great, because obviously working online has allowed me to help people all over the world, but it also means I get to spend a bit more time with my family as well, which is really important for me. And then the other side of it, I suppose, has been the social media element, which I didn't use Instagram or TikTok, or I didn't really even watch YouTube before I started Top Crew. And since I've started doing stuff, we've got as of today, we've got sort of just short of 30,000 people on Instagram, had 2.5 million views in the last month. It's become a bit of a side passion project for me to just try and give as much knowledge away as I can for free, and to try and just share the things that I've learned over the last nearly 20 years of coaching. Because I think there's not a lot of support. There's not a lot of information out there. What information is out there is definitely geared around a very particular type of person. And people who don't fit that, there's not necessarily information. There's not necessarily resources. And I also just think that often we make rowing more complicated than it really is. I think there's some really core, simple principles that I try and stick to, and I have from coaching for a long time, that make boats go fast and help people become better rowers and better athletes.
So, question: this is just besides schedule. What is a big? What's a big issue that you see, or what's a big what's a big issue that a masters rower might have besides the schedule, keeping them away from getting faster?
So number one, from a technical perspective, is that a lot of masters don't know how to, and a lot of people, I think, it comes from being sitting at a desk most of the time in society. A lot of people don't know how to rotate their pelvis and to be able to row as long a stroke as they could. I have a lot of people who tell me, I can't row long. I've got terrible hamstrings. My hamstrings are really short. I can't row long. And as soon as we teach them how to rotate their pelvis, they can row, a full length, and they go, wow, I didn't know I could do that. I myself, I've never been good at stretching. I have terrible hamstring length. I can still, on the erg, very comfortably row all the way to the cage at the front. I can still row 67 degrees in the single scull, even though I'm, not as light as I was when I was fighting weight. Because of the ability to rotate the pelvis. So I think that's probably the number one thing. Try and work with people to improve. And then the other is that a lot of people don't know how to engage. I mean, there's lots of things, but The other one that's, I guess, a really easy fix for a lot of people is learning to use their lats instead of their shoulders, which means that they transfer force better. They swing the body later, which means they get more of their peak force towards the part where the blades are coming through square off. So it's the most force through the most mechanically efficient part of the stroke. All these types of things really help people to go faster. But I think the other side of it is just from a training element. A lot of masters either don't have a structure at all, they just kind of figure it out when they get there on the day. That's probably the most common. Or when they do have a program, it's a generic program that maybe's been adapted from the youth program within their club, or it was something that people did when they were younger and someone in the club has written a bit of a program for everyone, but it's really based off what they did when they were at university. And it's certainly not specific to them. It's not specific to their context, and it doesn't actually target the things that are going to make the difference for them, because particularly as people get older and things like sarcopenia, so muscle wasting and things like that, they need to focus on different things. And a lot of those programs that people are referring to might have been written for 2,000 meters. Certainly not written for 1,000. There's very few programs out there that were written for 1,000 meters. So if people don't have the knowledge about programming, they're not necessarily going to be able to find something to just pick up and use. And that's part of what I provide is personalized programming, but it's also part of what I try and get across in the educational stuff I do online is just some of the core principles, so people can at least have a structure to be able to train in a way that's going to be effective for them.
And then this is just a personal question on the coaching side. How do you explain that pelvis rotation? Because I always try to explain it from the hips, and I don't know if it's ever if I'm actually ever connecting with an athlete when I'm trying to explain it.
So the way I typically would teach someone would be if they're sitting on I'm sitting on a chair with a back at the moment. I was just to start by slumping. You've come home from long day work, you just slump down, your back's against the back of it, and you feel your weight shift onto your haunches. So it's on the back of your bum. And then just imagine you have a string or something that's going to pull you up. As you do that, you actually feel that your position that you're sitting on shifts from being on the back of your bum onto the two bony parts. Actually, the ischial tuberosities, but I call them the sitting bones or the pin bones. So once you get up onto that, okay, now you're in a position where you can actually rotate forward and back from your pelvis. The next thing I'd do would be on the ergo, would be to get them to do that, get that postural setting to be able to get up onto the pin bones, and then would be to row, to bodies over to the point of stretch. Release the knees, so just allow a soft knee break, and then stretch a little bit further. And what they'll see is if they're rocking from those sitting bones, is the first time they'll rock over and they will get the limit of their hamstring flexibility, because when you are in anterior pelvic tilt, and I'm using some of the technical terms now, but when you are in anterior pelvic tilt, where the hips have rotated forward, the hamstrings do get pulled across that ischial tuberosity and do get tight. And that's often what people feel. They go, oh, I'm so tight in my hamstrings, that's why I can't rock. But then if you release the knees and I'll go a little bit further, it just takes that pressure off the hamstring and you can actually rotate further from the pelvis. So once they get that idea a few times of being able to, rock to the point of stretch, release the tension, set it a bit further, then I'd start getting to work with, maybe pauses to quarter slide, so that they can have that soft knee break already built in, but really focus on getting the handle set over the ankles. Or, for some people who are hypermobile, they might be able to get over the toes at that position, as long as they don't start to collapse in that. So that's the key thing. That's the kind of the progression I'd use, is first teach someone how to sit on the sitting bones, which allows them to actually shift their pelvis out of posterior pelvic tilt and into a neutral position. And then that rock over, soften the knees, and set a bit further, allows them to just get the sense of how far they can actually rock from their pelvis. And often when people see that, they just go, oh, wow, I had no idea I could row that long, that comfortably.
Thank you, Sam. Thank you. And I'm going to rewatch this over, and I'm going to make sure that, I can articulate this the best way to my athletes, because I see that's one of the biggest common errors. So not even for masters, I think that's just for all rowers to get started on that end. And I'm really grateful for that. So Sam, tell me what you think about, your social media following. You've talked about the engagement there in the millions. And then, your following count up into like the 30Ks. Are you surprised about that at all? Or what's your thoughts on that?
I remember when I had, I think, 100 views on a post, early on, and I was like telling my wife, "Oh my god, 100 people have viewed that! How crazy is that?" And I look back at some of my early content, and it was dreadful, and that's fine. It's just all part of learning, like anything, and it's really cool. It's great, and there's some people who comment all the time, and you always start to build a little bit of a relationship with those people because you see that engagement on a consistent basis, which is cool. But yeah, definitely surprised by the rate. And I mean, in particularly since over the past 12 months. So I think in October last year, I think I had about 100 followers. I think I screenshotted on like October 3rd or something because I ticked over 100, and I was like, oh my goodness, 100 people are wanting to listen to me. And so for it to grow, 30,000 basically over that time has been a bit surreal. And it's funny, you're going to. I think the weirdest one was a few months ago. I was down at the boat shed and someone said, "You're that guy from Top Crew, aren't you?" And I was like, "That's so weird to actually have, you're the person from the thing." So, I mean, it's been cool and exciting, but it's definitely not been expected. And I think what I like to think is that people do want to know more. I'm often talking about some of the science, or some as best I can in 90 seconds, some of the science behind some of the things, some of the there's some technical terms that I use and things like that, and sometimes I wonder, is this people just not really going to care? But then you get a lot of engagement and feedback, and I get people who message me and say, I really find your posts valuable, and that obviously motivates me to keep doing it. Because if people are getting value from it, even if they've not paid me a cent, that's completely fine. Because if I can feel like I'm helping lots and lots of people in rowing, that's actually really cool. And if it's difficult for me to kind of square it with where it was when I started, which was that I was helping out a couple of people's siblings, and then wanting to help out some people who were I knew were not getting support, but then to have thousands of people who follow and watch and engage is it's really cool, but quite humbling, to be honest.
And last question here, Sam, and I'm thankful for this. Thank you for sacrificing your Sunday morning to have this conversation. If someone's watching this and they're interested in the Top Crew Academy, what would you tell them? What would you tell them?
I would tell them if it's something that you're interested in, you can contact me either through the website or through Instagram. I work with people of all different ability levels. I sometimes have people say to me when I speak to them, I don't know if I'm quite at the level to work with you. I've worked with absolute beginners. I work with people who are trying to make national teams. I have a small number of people who are hopeful to row at LA. It's a full spectrum of people. The most important things are that you really want to improve, that you're actually looking for improvement and motivated to do it, because in any online service, I'm not there to physically give you a rousing if you're not doing the work. So you have to have a degree of motivation already, and we need to be able to work together at least 3 times a week. So that's what I say. If we can't do 3 times a week, it's probably not able for me to give you enough value. But I work with people who are inside school programs, inside club programs, even inside the high performance programs, to provide some additional support. And it's just I'm not precious about things. If I don't mind if people are working with other people as well, or with strength and conditioning coaches, or whatever. Part of having been an exercise physiologist, part of that background is in allied health, where we work collaboratively with people who have different areas of expertise, and that's part of the growth that I'm planning on in Top Crew Academy over the next few months, is bringing in a sports psychologist and a sports dietitian, as well as an additional coach. So there's extra levels of expertise and things that people are better at than me, so that we can just provide more and better quality support to people we work with. But yeah, if it's something you're interested in, feel free to reach out either through Instagram, email, or the website. And we work with people of all different ability levels.
Well, Sam, thank you for being on the show today. Any last things that you want to bring up? Anybody you want to thank? Any special thanks or anything for the people? And I really appreciate it. So thank you very much.
Oh, my pleasure. And thanks very much for having me on. I think if I had the opportunity to do a shout out, as I mentioned back earlier, just like to make a special mention of Alan Bromley, who was my coach at school, who passed away this week. He was a great man. He was a good man who cared a lot about the people that he worked with, and I do like to think that I try and embody some of his best qualities in my own coaching. And he will be missed.